Thrawn is pretty widely considered the best of the strategists and military commanders of the Star Wars galaxy in either Legends or canon, and today we're going to find out who joins him from the other factions within Star Wars Legends. Thrawn's Sherlock Holmesian approach to situations and his creative adaptation of existing strategies to exploit weaknesses in his enemies is second to none, and while new audiences haven't been exposed to this too much yet in Ahsoka, we're probably about to see a lot more of it. The first appearance of the Grand Admiral when he was all blue and still new saw him completely destroy a New Republic task force following an information raid in the archives kept on the planet Obra Sky, a former base of the Imperial Ubictorate who had been part of the intelligence arm of the Galactic Empire. The campaigns which followed saw Thrawn and his Imperial forces taking up essentially the old role of the Rebellion, inciting rivalries between New Republic leaders and scavenging additional forces in a variety of unconventional ways. He grew his manpower with a cloning program, and one of the biggest battles of his campaign was a raid on the Sluivan shipyards, where he used captured mining equipment to bore his way through hulls intending to put stormtrooper teams on board and get the ships out of there. Ultimately, the battle failed to acquire Thrawn any new ships thanks to the presence of Lando Calrissian, who the mining equipment had been stolen from. However, the solution here had involved boring entirely through the ships instead of just into them, meaning even in this failure, Thrawn was able to put those ships out of commission. Thrawn was also able to convince entire planets to join him by tricking them into thinking he had developed a way to shoot through planetary shields. In reality, he was just coordinating the fire between his ships outside the shield and cloaked ships inside the shields, which were coordinated with the use of a dark side force user. With the other factions, I'll be talking about a few different options, but while we're just doing Thrawn here for the Empire, and I guess technically for the Chiss, in my recent video on the Grand Admirals and their history, I did bring up a few others who deserve honorable mentions within the Empire as well. The Clone Wars were a very different strategic environment than the Galactic Civil War, given it had been a long time since any large-scale galactic war of any kind, making the best commander a more difficult question to answer than in later periods, where there's a longer period to go off of, with some people getting way more experience. In a lot of cases, the battles just felt like they were commanded by Zap Brannigan on both sides.
Knowing their weakness, I sent wave after wave of my own men at them, until they reached their limit and shut down.
But on the CIS side, there's two clear standouts, General Grievous and Admiral Trench. One common thread with both of these characters is that they both came from regions engulfed in conflict in the time before the Clone Wars. Grievous, also known as Kaiman Jai Shalil, was the leader of the Kaleesh in the Huk War, where the Yamri species, also known as the Huk, had been attempting to enslave the Kaleesh and other local species. Grievous gained a legendary reputation for his skills in battle, and the war ended with Grievous forcing the Yamri back to the planet Huk, before the Republic joined and imposed sanctions on the Kaleesh for their actions against the Yamri, forcing Grievous to support his people by signing on with the Banking Clan. After a shuttle accident involving a bomb and orchestrated by Count Dooku, Grievous was reconstructed as the cyborg general we know from the films. While he was an impressive warrior in his own right, and while his taking over the posting of Supreme Commander finally united the CIS under one command structure made a huge difference in the war, I do think he loses out to Trench as the best commander in the faction. Trench had a similarly long history of command in the Anduin Wars, where he worked for the Spivarelda government in the Lambda sector, attempting to suppress the Anduin Free Colonies, a group of 15 worlds which hoped to break away from Spivarelda control. These brutal wars, in which Trench achieved multiple victories, ended with yet another victory by Trench at Rakrish. Unfortunately for him, but fortunately for the Free Colonies, who doubted the Republic would ever intervene, Trench's victory was so impressive the Republic was forced to take notice, and attempted to demilitarize the colonies in 39 BBY, or years before the Battle of Yavin, further pushing Trench into a hatred of the Republic. Trench would again find himself on the opposite side of the Republic in the years before the Clone Wars. He orchestrated a blockade of Malastare in 34 BBY on behalf of the Corporate Alliance, and when Wolf Yularen arrived with the Republic force attempting to lift the blockade, Trench nearly destroyed the entire task force. It was only further intervention involving the Jedi which finally defeated the Alliance and left Trench presumed dead for the first of many, many times. While Trench may not have personally been anywhere near on the level of Grievous as a direct combatant, I think his performance in the years leading up to the Clone Wars and in the Clone Wars themselves as a strategist put him above Grievous and the other CIS commanders for our rankings here, and arguably he was among the best on either side in the war. While Wolf Yularen is probably who you think of most when thinking of the Republic naval commanders, and he's definitely no slouch, I think he loses out to a few others and massively benefits from his partnership with Anakin. I do think this is the hardest faction to talk about given the breadth of media and characters available. Octavian Grant, I think, is the first one worth an honorable mention though. We get very few details of his career in the Clone Wars, but he is pretty regularly noted as a highly successful commander during the wars, and we know he crushed the remnants of the Trade Federation's military under Marath Voro at Farstein after the war, capturing Voro soon after that battle. He was also among the more competent Grand Admirals in the Empire and one of the few of the Republic commanders that did go on to become a Grand Admiral. I do talk a lot more about Grant in the video I mentioned earlier about the Grand Admirals as well. The second and third honorable mentions go to Yondo Dana and Terranald Screed, a pair of captains who led the newly minted Victory Fleet in the Foros campaign against the also formidable CIS Admiral Duoningo. Their victory over the Bulwark fleet almost came at the cost of Screed's life, but the pair went on to be hugely influential commanders in the Rebellion in Dodana's case and the Empires in Screed's. The final commander, who I would argue is the best in the Republic during the Clone Wars, is Adar Talon. He got his start as a starfighter pilot and then a commander, devising a swath of influential tactics and writing a treatise on starfighter tactics, which was heavily used by the Empire in the development of the TIE Fighter. We hear of basically no defeats for Talon, and a few pretty decisive and important victories at planets like Balamak and Rendili. At the former, his victory enabled the restoration of holonet access in the Talat sector, and in the latter, the Republic's victory kept an important shipyard out of Separatist hands. Talon then went on to be a leading figure against the CIS holdouts as well, much like Grant, quelling the Cymurthian insurrection of Toonbuk Tora from the bridge of his Praetor-class flagship Battalion, before he started to become a vocal critic of the Empire and ultimately joined the Rebellion. The New Republic and its successor state, the Galactic Alliance, which I'll cover as one group here, have a similar problem where there's a ton of characters from a bunch of different media, but I'm going to narrow it down to 3 who we'll talk about right now. First is Wedge Antilles. Wedge has about 40 years worth of battles under his belt in Legends, orchestrating some of the most important victories of the Rebel Alliance and New Republic and Galactic Alliance and even the Corellian Confederation, often from the comfort of his starfighter cockpit. He was influential in both the planning and execution of the liberation of Coruscant, and in the Yuuzhan Vong War took more of a fleet commander role, modernizing the tactics of the Rebel Alliance to use guerrilla strikes against the Yuuzhan Vong, and ultimately taking down one of the other members on this list using those tactics. To throw in an honorable mention solely from the books for the New Republic, since you may be able to guess who I'm going to give the actual top spot to here, we have Nek Buatsu. He was basically hailed as the new tactical genius of his age, on the level of almost Thrawn during the Galactic Alliance's conflicts with the Killiks and the Corellians, eventually rising to the rank of Chief of Naval Operations, essentially the GA's Supreme Commander. The problem is most of his tactical genius was theoretical, and much of it was based on his performance in simulations, particularly the Thrawn simulator, which as you may be able to guess, simulated battles against Thrawn. While he did often live up to his theoretical reputation in battle, showing insight into his enemies to the point that the Jedi Master Kip Durin thought he must be Force sensitive, he also proved a bit naive in some cases. For example, he lost his flagship, the Admiral Akbar, when statues of himself full of tiny Killik enemies were brought on board Trojan Horse style. Ultimately, I think the top spot for the New Republic, though, has to go to Admiral Akbar himself. I'll forgive him for wanting to leave Endor, considering his other many victories in both that battle and in the following decades. He did nearly lose his position as Supreme Commander a few times due to his rivalry with future Chief of State and constant jerk Borsfelia, but he was so well respected that his return to an advisory role during the Yuuzhan Vong War, broadcast with the simple 3-word message "Akbar is back," prompted fleet-wide celebrations. While Wedge began to implement highly successful strikes against the Yuuzhan Vong and undercut some of the New Republic's political turmoil by setting up a resistance movement led by himself and other rebel heroes, Akbar was the mastermind behind the strategy of small skirmishes to gain extra experience points for the New Republic and Alliance crews. And it was Akbar's strategy that ultimately allowed the New Republic to fight the Yuuzhan Vong and win in bigger pitched battles during the tide of the war. Unfortunately, the victory didn't come until Akbar had died due to his declining health in his old age after a lifetime of being a fish out of water. The final group we'll talk about today are the Yuuzhan Vong themselves. Nash Choka and Sevong La, as the 2 supreme commanders of the Yuuzhan Vong forces, deserve a mention, but a lot of the failures of the war ultimately come down to them. Choka was in a far more difficult position, and was at least the one to recognize the writing was on the wall, but it's hard to give either of them the top spot as a military strategist. A lot of the war's early successes came from commanders who were taking a much more active role than Sae-Vong Law was, like Malak Kar, who was the architect of several major Yuuzhan Vong victories. He fell into disgrace when his fleet failed at Fondor thanks to the firing of the massive superweapon Centerpoint Station in the Corellian system. You can kind of fault him for this loss, but ultimately when he was at Fondor there wasn't much he can do. The Centerpoint Station was either going to fire or it wasn't. And then after the battle, when the war started to turn more against the Yuuzhan Vong, Malak Kar was already disgraced or dead, so he couldn't really have had much of an impact on the Vong losing beyond that. Sae-Vong Law had actually replaced the person I think most deserving of the Vong's top spot as War Master before the Galactic Invasion, his father Chulkang. Chulkang Law developed many of the tactics which would be used by the Yuuzhan Vong in the early, successful parts of the war. However, his opposition to invading when the time actually came saw him relegated to teaching and being replaced in the top spot by his more enthusiastic, but ultimately less capable son, Sae-Vong. And given how the war ended for the Yuuzhan Vong, I think Chulkang's position that they probably shouldn't do it only counts in his favor. All of the Yuuzhan Vong leaders were basically dead by the end, and their carefully enforced caste system was pretty much overturned. Sae-Vong called upon his father to defeat Wedge Antilles at Borleas. While Wedge ultimately came out on top, I think it's hard to put anyone else over Chulkang here. Those are my choices for the 5 best commanders in the 5 biggest Star Wars Legends factions though. Let me know if you'd have anyone else in one of these top spots, or if there are any other honorable mentions you think are worth throwing in. There's definitely a lot of characters out there, especially for the Republic, Empire, and New Republic, so there's a lot to look at. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.